Chapter 41 of Arthur Mervyn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Arthur Mervyn by Charles Brockden Brown. Chapter 41. Next morning I arose betimes, and equipped myself without delay. I had 8 or 10 miles to walk, so far from the town being the residence of these people, and I forthwith repaired to their dwelling. The persons whom I desired to see were known to me only by name, and by their place of abode. It was a mother and her 3 daughters to whom I now carried the means not only of competence but riches, means which they, no doubt, had long ago despaired of regaining, and which, among all possible messengers, one of my age and guise would be the least suspected of being able to restore. I arrived through intricate ways at 11 o'clock at the house of Mrs. Maurice. It was a neat dwelling, in a very fanciful and rustic style, in the bosom of a valley, which, when decorated by the verdure and blossoms of the coming season, must possess many charms. At present it was naked and dreary. As I approached it through a long avenue, I observed 2 female figures, walking arm and arm and slowly to and fro in the path in which I now was. "These," said I, "are daughters of the family. Graceful, well-dressed, fashionable girls they seem at this distance. May they be deserving of the good tidings which I bring." Seeing them turn towards the house, I mended my pace that I might overtake them and request their introduction of me to their mother. As I more nearly approached, they again turned, and, perceiving me, they stood as if in expectation of my message. I went up to them. A single glance, cast at each, made me suspect that they were not sisters, but, somewhat to my disappointment, there was nothing highly prepossessing in the countenance of either. They were what is every day met with, though less embellished by brilliant drapery and turban, in markets and streets. An air somewhat haughty, somewhat supercilious, lessened still more their attractions. These defects, however, were nothing to me. I inquired of her that seemed to be the elder of the 2 for Mrs. Maurice. "She is indisposed," was the cold reply. "That is unfortunate. Is it not possible to see her?" "No," with still more gravity. I was somewhat at a loss how to proceed. A pause ensued. At length the same lady resumed, "What's your business? You can leave your message with me." "With nobody but her, if she be not very indisposed." "She is very indisposed," interrupted she, peevishly. "If you cannot leave your message, you may take it back again, for she must not be disturbed." This was a singular reception. I was disconcerted and silent. I knew not what to say. "Perhaps," I at last observed, "some other time." "No," with increasing heat, "no other time. She is more likely to be worse than better. Come, Betsy," said she, taking hold of her companion's arm, and, hieing into the house, shut the door after her and disappeared. I stood at the bottom of the steps, confounded at such strange and unexpected treatment. I could not withdraw till my purpose was accomplished. After a moment's pause, I stepped to the door and pulled the bell. A negro came, of a very unpropitious aspect, and, opening the door, looked at me in silence. To my question, was Mrs. Maurice to be seen, he made some answer in a jargon which I could not understand, but his words were immediately followed by an unseen person within the house. "Mrs. Maurice can't be seen by anybody. Come in, Cato, and shut the door." This injunction was obeyed by Cato without ceremony. Here was a dilemma. I came with 10,000 pounds in my hands, to bestow freely on these people, and such was the treatment I received. "I must adopt," said I, "a new mode." I lifted the latch, without a second warning, and, Cato having disappeared, went into a room, the door of which chanced to be open on my right hand. I found within the 2 females whom I had accosted in the portico. I now addressed myself to the younger. This intrusion, when I have explained the reason of it, will, I hope, be forgiven. I come, madam—" "Yes," interrupted the other, with a countenance suffused by indignation. "I know very well whom you come from, and what it is that prompts this insolence; but your employer shall see that we have not sunk so low as he imagines. Cato! Bob! I say!" "My employer, madam! I see you labour under some great mistake. I have no employer. I come from a great distance. I come to bring intelligence of the utmost importance to your family. I come to benefit and not to injure you." By this time Bob and Cato, two sturdy blacks, entered the room. "Turn this person," said the imperious lady, regardless of my explanations, "out of the house. Don't you hear me?" she continued, observing that they looked one upon the other and hesitated. "Surely, madam," said I, "you are precipitate. You are treating like an enemy one who will prove himself your mother's best friend." "Will you leave the house?" she exclaimed, quite beside herself with anger. "Villains, why don't you do as I bid you?" The blacks looked upon each other as if waiting for an example. Their habitual deference for everything white, no doubt, held their hands from what they regarded as a profanation. At least Bob said, in a whining, beseeching tone, "Why, missy, Massa Buckra wanna go for do. Den he wanna go for we." The lady now burst into tears of rage. She held out her hand menacingly. "Will you leave the house?" "Not willingly," said I, in a mild tone. "I came too far to return with the business that brought me unperformed. I am persuaded, madam, you mistake my character and my views. I have a message to deliver your mother, which deeply concerns her and your happiness if you are her daughter. I merely wished to see her and leave her with a piece of important news, news in which her fortune is deeply interested." The words had a wonderful effect upon the young lady. Her anger was checked. "Good God!" she exclaimed. "Are you Watson?" "No, I am only Watson's representative, and could come to do all that Watson could do if he were present." She was now importunate to know my business. "My business lies with Mrs. Maurice. Advertisements which I have seen direct me to her and to this house, and to her only shall I deliver my message." "Perhaps," said she, with a face of apology, "I have mistaken you. Mrs. Maurice is my mother. She is really indisposed, but I can stand in her place on this occasion." "You cannot represent her in this instance. If I cannot have access to her now, I must go, and shall return when you are willing to grant it." "Nay," replied she is not, perhaps, so very sick but that I will go, and see if she will admit you." So saying, she left me for 3 minutes, and, returning, said her mother wished to see me. I followed upstairs at her request, and, entering an ill-furnished chamber, found, seated in an armchair, a lady seemingly in years, pale and visibly infirm. The lines of her countenance were far from laying claim to my reverence. It was too much like the daughter's. She looked at me, at my entrance, with great eagerness, and said, in a sharp tone, "Pray, friend, what is it that you want with me? Make haste, tell your story, and be gone." "My story is a short one, and easily told. Amos Watson was your agent in Jamaica. He sold an estate belonging to you, and received the money." "He did?" said she, attempting ineffectually to rise from her seat, and her eyes beaming with a significance that shocked me. "He did, the villain, and purloined the money, to the ruin of me and my daughters. But if there be justice on earth, it will overtake him. I trust I shall have the pleasure one day. I hope to hear he's hanged. Well, but go on, friend. He did sell it, I tell you." "He sold it for £10,000, I resumed, "and invested this sum in bills of exchange. Watson is dead. These bills came into my hands. I was lately informed by the public papers who were the real owners, and have come from Philadelphia with no other view than to restore them to you. There they are," continued I, placing them in her lap, entire and untouched. She seized the papers, and looked at me and her daughter, by turns, with an air of one suddenly bewildered. She seemed speechless, and, growing suddenly more ghastly pale, leaned her head back upon the chair. The daughter screamed, and hastened to support the languid parent, who difficultly articulated, "Oh, I am sick! Sick to death! Put me on the bed!" I was astonished and affrighted at this scene. Some of the domestics, of both colours, entered, and gazed at me with surprise. Involuntarily I withdrew, and returned to the room below, into which I had first entered, and which I now found deserted. I was for some time at a loss to guess at the cause of these appearances. At length it occurred to me that joy was the source of the sickness that had seized Mrs. Maurice. The abrupt recovery of what had probably been deemed irretrievable would naturally produce this effect on a mind of a certain texture. I was deliberating whether to stay or go, when the daughter entered the room, and, after expressing some surprise at seeing me, whom she supposed to have retired, told me that her mother wished to see me again before my departure. In this request there was no kindness. All was cold, supercilious, and sullen. I obeyed the summons without speaking. I found Mrs. Maurice seated in her armchair, much in her former guise. Without desiring me to be seated, or relaxing aught in her asperity of looks and tones, "Pray, friend, how did you come by these papers?" "I assure you, madam, they were honestly come by," answered I, sedately and with half a smile. "But if the whole is there that was missing, the mode and time in which they came to me is a matter of concern only to myself. Is there any deficiency?" "I am not sure. I don't know much of these matters. There may be less. I dare say there is. I shall know that soon. I expect a friend of mine every minute, who will look them over. I don't doubt you can give a good account of yourself." "I doubt not but I can, to those who have a right to demand it. In this case, curiosity must be very urgent indeed before I shall consent to gratify it." "You must know this is a suspicious case. Watson, to be sure, embezzled the money. To be sure, you are his accomplice." "Certainly," said I, "my conduct on this occasion proves that. What I have brought to you of my own accord, what I have restored to you, fully and unconditionally, it is plain Watson embezzled, and that I was aiding in the fraud. To restore what was never stolen always betrays the thief. To give what might be kept without suspicion is, without doubt, arrant knavery. To be serious, madam, in coming thus far for this purpose I have done enough, and must now bid you farewell." "Nay, don't go yet. I have something more to say to you. My friend, I am sure, will be here presently. There he is," noticing a peal upon the bell. "Polly, go down and see if that's Mr. Somers. If it is, bring him up." The daughter went. I walked to the window, absorbed in my own reflections. I was disappointed and dejected. The scene before me was the unpleasing reverse of all that my fancy, while coming hither, had foreboded. I expected to find virtuous indigence and sorrow lifted, by my means, to affluence and exultation. I expected to witness the tears of gratitude and the caresses of affection. What had I found? Nothing but sordidness, stupidity, and illiberal suspicion. The daughter stayed much longer than the mother's patience could endure. She knocked against the floor with her heel. A servant came up. "Where's Polly, you slut? It was not you, hussy, that I wanted. It was her." "She is talking in the parlour with a gentleman." "Mr. Somers, I suppose, hey, fool? Run with my compliments to him, wench. Tell him, please walk up." "It is not Mr. Somers, ma'am." "No? Who then, saucebox? What gentleman can have anything to do with Polly?" "I don't know, ma'am." "Who said you did, impertinence? Run and tell her I want her this instant." The summons was not delivered, or Polly did not think proper to obey it. Full 10 minutes of thoughtful silence on my part, and of muttered vexation and impatience on that of the old lady, elapsed before Polly's entrance. As soon as she appeared, the mother began to complain bitterly of her inattention and neglect; but Polly, taking no notice of her, addressed herself to me, and told me that a gentleman below wished to see me. I hastened down, and found a stranger of a plain appearance in the parlour. His aspect was liberal and ingenuous, and I quickly collected from his discourse that this was the brother-in-law of Watson, and the companion of his last voyage. Chapter 41. Chapter 42 of Arthur Mervyn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Arthur Mervyn by Charles Brockden Brown. Chapter 42. My eyes sparkled with pleasure at this unexpected interview, and I willingly confessed my desire to communicate all the knowledge of his brother's destiny which I possessed. He told me that, returning late to Baltimore on the last evening, he found his sister in much agitation and distress, which, after a time, she explained to him. She likewise put the packets I had left into his hands. "I leave you to imagine," continued he, "my surprise and curiosity at this discovery. I was, of course, impatient to see the bearer of such extraordinary tidings. This morning, inquiring for one of your appearance at the taverns, I was, at length, informed of your arrival yesterday in the stage, of your going out alone in the evening, of your subsequent return, and of your early departure this morning. Accidentally I lighted on your footsteps, and, by suitable inquiries on the road, have finally traced you hither. You told my sister her husband was dead. You left with her papers that were probably in his possession at the time of his death. I understand from Miss Maurice that the bills belonging to her mother have just been delivered to her. I presume you have no objection to clear up this mystery. To you I am anxious to unfold everything, at this moment or at any time, but the sooner the more agreeable to me. I will do it." "This," said he, looking around him, "is no place. There is an inn, not 100 yards from this gate, where I have left my horse. Will you go thither?" I readily consented, and, calling for a private apartment, I laid before this man every incident of my life connected with Welbeck and Watson. My full, circumstantial, and explicit story appeared to remove every doubt which he might have entertained of my integrity. In Williams I found a plain, good man, of a temper confiding and affectionate. My narration being finished, he expressed, by unaffected tokens, his wonder and his grief on account of Watson's destiny. To my inquiries, which were made with frankness and fervour respecting his own and his sister's condition, he said that the situation of both was deplorable till the recovery of this property. They had been saved from utter ruin, from beggary and a jail, only by the generosity and lenity of his creditors, who did not suffer the suspicious circumstances attending Watson's disappearance to outweigh former proofs of his probity. They had never relinquished the hopes of receiving some tidings of their kinsman. I related what had just passed in the house of Mrs. Maurice, and requested to know from him the history and character of this family. "They have treated you," he answered, "exactly as any one who knew them would have predicted. The mother is narrow, ignorant, bigoted, and avaricious. The eldest daughter, whom you saw, resembles the old lady in many things. Age, indeed, may render the similitude complete. At present, pride and ill humour are her chief characteristics. The youngest daughter has nothing in mind or person in common with her family. Where they are irascible, she is patient. Where they are imperious, she is humble. Where they are covetous, she is liberal; where they are ignorant and indolent, she is studious and skilful. It is rare, indeed, to find a young lady more amiable than Miss Fanny Maurice, or has had more crosses and afflictions to sustain. The eldest daughter always extorted the supply of her wants from her parents by threats and importunities, but the younger could never be prevailed upon to employ the same means, and hence she suffered inconveniences which, to any other girl born to an equal rank, would have been, to the last degree, humiliating and vexatious. To her they only afforded new opportunities for the display of her most shining virtues, fortitude and charity. No instance of their sordidness or tyranny ever stole a murmur from her. For what they had given, existence and a virtuous education, she said they were entitled to gratitude. What they withheld was their own, in the use of which they were not accountable to her. She was not ashamed to owe her subsistence to her own industry, and was only held by the pride of her family. In this instance their pride was equal to their avarice, from seeking out some lucrative kind of employment. Since the shock which their fortune sustained by Watson's disappearance, she has been permitted to pursue this plan, and she now teaches music in Baltimore for a living. No one, however, in the highest rank, can be more generally respected and caressed than she is. But will not the recovery of this money make a favourable change in her condition? I can hardly tell, but I am inclined to think it will not. It will not change her mother's character. Her pride may be awakened anew, and she may oblige Miss Fanny to relinquish her new profession, and that will be a change to be deplored. What good has been done, then, by restoring this money? If pleasure be good, you must have conferred a great deal on the Maurices, upon the mother and two of the daughters at least, the only pleasure, indeed, which their natures can receive. It is less than if you had raised them from absolute indigence, which has not been the case, since they had wherewithal to live upon, besides their Jamaica property. But how," continued Williams, suddenly recollecting himself, "have you claimed the reward promised to him who should restore these bills?" "What reward?" "No less than $1,000. It was publicly promised under the hands of Mrs. Maurice and of Hemmings, her husband's executor." "Really?" said I. "That circumstance escaped my attention, and I wonder that it did. But is it too late to repair the evil?" "Then you have no scruple to accept the reward?" "Certainly not. Could you suspect me of so strange a punctilio as that?" "Yes, but I know not why. The story you have just finished taught me to expect some unreasonable refinement upon that head. To be hired, to be bribed, to do our duty is supposed by some to be degrading. This is no such bribe to me. I should have acted just as I have done, had no recompense been promised. In truth, this has been my conduct, for I never once thought of the reward; but, now that you remind me of it, I would gladly see it bestowed. To fulfil their engagements in this respect is no more than justice in the Maurices. To one in my condition, the money will be highly useful. If these people were poor, or generous and worthy, or if I myself were already rich, I might less repine at their withholding it. But, things being as they are with them and with me, it would, I think, be gross injustice in them to withhold, and in me to refuse." "That injustice," said Williams, "will, on their part, I fear, be committed. 'Tis pity you first applied to Mrs. Maurice. Nothing can be expected from her avarice unless it be wrested from her by a lawsuit." "That is a force which I shall never apply." "Had you gone first to Hemmings, you might, I think, have looked for payment.
He is not a mean man. $1,000 he must know is not much to give for 40,000. Perhaps, indeed, it may not yet be too late. I am well known to him, and, if you please, will attend you to him in the evening, and state your claim."
I thankfully accepted this offer, and went with him accordingly. I found that Hemmings had been with Mrs. Maurice in the course of the day, had received from her intelligence of this transaction, and had entertained the expectation of a visit from me for this very purpose. While Williams explained to him the nature of my claim, he scanned me with great intentness. His austere and inflexible brow afforded me little room to hope for success, and this hopelessness was confirmed by his silence and perplexity when Williams had made an end. "To be sure," he said, after some pause, "the contract was explicit. To be sure, the conditions on Mr. Mervyn's side have been performed. Certain it is, the bills are entire and complete. But Mrs. Maurice will not consent to do her part, and Mrs. Maurice, to whom the papers were presented, is the person by whom, according to the terms of the contract, the reward must be paid."
"But Mrs. Maurice, you know, sir, may be legally compelled to pay," said Williams.
"Perhaps she may, but I tell you plainly that she never will do the thing without compulsion. Legal process, however, in this case, will have other inconveniences besides delay. Some curiosity will naturally be excited as to the history of these papers. Watson disappeared a 12-month ago. Who can avoid asking, where have these papers been deposited all this while, and how came this person in possession of them? That kind of curiosity, said I, is natural and laudable, and gladly I would gratify it. Disclosure or concealment in that case, however, would nowise affect my present claim. Whether a bond, legally executed, shall be paid, does not depend upon determining whether the payer is fondest of boiled mutton or roast beef. Truth, in the first case, has no connection with truth in the second. So far from eluding this curiosity, so far from studying concealment, I am anxious to publish the truth. "You are right, to be sure," said Hemmings. "Curiosity is a natural, but only an incidental consequence in this case. I have no reason for desiring that it should be an unpleasant consequence to you."
"Well, sir," said Williams, "you think that Arthur Mervyn has no remedy in this case but the law?"
"Mrs. Maurice, to be sure, will never pay but on compulsion. Mervyn should have known his own interest better. While his left hand was stretched out to give, his right should have been held forth to receive. As it is, he must be contented with the aid of law. Any attorney will prosecute on condition of receiving half the sum when recovered." We now rose to take our leave, when Hemmings, desiring us to pause a moment, said, "To be sure, in the utmost strictness of the terms of our promise, the reward was to be paid by the person who received the papers, but it must be owned that your claim, at any rate, is equitable. I have money of the deceased Mr. Maurice in my hands. These very bills are now in my possession. I will therefore pay you your due, and take the consequences of an act of justice on myself. I was prepared for you. Sign that receipt, and there is a check for the amount."
End of chapter 42. '43 of Arthur Mervyn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Arthur Mervyn by Charles Brockden Brown, Chapter 43. This unexpected and agreeable decision was accompanied by an invitation to supper, at which we were treated by our host with much affability and kindness. Finding me the author of William's good fortune, as well as Mrs. Maurice's, and being assured by the former of his entire conviction of the rectitude of my conduct, he laid aside all reserve and distance with regard to me.
He inquired into my prospects and wishes, and professed his willingness to serve me. I dealt with equal unreserve and frankness. "I am poor," said I. "Money for my very expenses hither I have borrowed from a friend, to whom I am, in other respects, much indebted, and whom I expect to compensate only by gratitude and future services. In coming hither I expected only an increase of my debts, to sink still deeper into poverty, but happily the issue has made me rich. This hour has given me competence at least." "What! Call you $1,000 competence?" "More than competence, I call it an abundance. My own ingenuity, while I enjoy health, will enable me to live. This I regard as a fund, first to pay my debts, and next to supply deficiencies occasioned by untoward accidents or ill health, during the ensuing 3 or 4 years at least." We parted with this new acquaintance at a late hour, and I accepted William's invitation to pass the time I should spend at Baltimore, under his sister's roof. There were several motives for prolonging this stay. What I had heard of Miss Fanny Maurice excited strong wishes to be personally acquainted with her. This young lady was affectionately attached to Mrs. Watson, by whose means my wishes were easily accomplished. I never was in habits of reserve, even with those I had no reason to esteem. With those who claimed my admiration and affection, it was impossible to be incommunicative. Before the end of my second interview, both these women were mistresses of every momentous incident of my life, and of the whole chain of my feelings and opinions in relation to every subject, and particularly in relation to themselves. Every topic disconnected with these is comparatively lifeless and inert. I found it easy to win their attention, and to render them communicative in their turn. As full disclosures as I had made without condition or request, my inquiries and example easily obtained from Mrs. Watson and Miss Maurice. The former related every event of her youth, and the circumstances leading to her marriage. She depicted the character of her husband, and the whole train of suspenses and inquietudes occasioned by his disappearance. The latter did not hide from me her opinions on any important subject, and made me thoroughly acquainted with her actual situation. This intercourse was strangely fascinating. My heart was buoyed up by a kind of intoxication. I now found myself exalted to my genial element, and began to taste the delights of existence. In the intercourse of ingenuous and sympathetic minds, I found a pleasure which I had not previously conceived. The time flew swiftly away, and a fortnight passed almost before I was aware that a day had gone by. I did not forget the friends whom I had left behind, but maintained a punctual correspondence with Stevens, to whom I imparted all occurrences. The recovery of my friend's kinsman allowed him in a few days to return home. His first object was the consolation and relief of Carlton, whom, with much difficulty, he persuaded to take advantage of the laws in favour of insolvent debtors. Carlton's only debt was owing to his uncle, and, by rendering up every species of property, except his clothes and the implements of his trade, he obtained a full discharge. In conjunction with his sister, he once more assumed the pen, and, being no longer burdened with debts he was unable to discharge, he resumed, together with his pen, his cheerfulness. Their mutual industry was sufficient for their decent and moderate subsistence. The chief reason for my hasty return was my anxiety respecting Clemenza Lodi. This reason was removed by the activity and benevolence of my friend. He paid this unfortunate stranger a visit at Mrs. Villars's. Access was easily obtained, and he found her sunk into the deepest melancholy. The recent loss of her child, the death of Welbeck, of which she was soon apprized, her total dependence upon those with whom she was placed, who, however, had always treated her without barbarity or indecorum, were the calamities that weighed down her spirits. My friend easily engaged her confidence and gratitude, and prevailed upon her to take refuge under his own roof. Mrs. Wentworth's scruples, as well as those of Mrs. Fielding, were removed by his arguments and entreaties, and they consented to take upon themselves and divide between them the care of her subsistence and happiness. They condescended to express much curiosity respecting me, and some interest in my welfare, and promised to receive me on my return on the footing of a friend. With some reluctance, I at length bade my new friends farewell, and returned to Philadelphia. Nothing remained before I should enter on my projected scheme of study and employment, under the guidance of Stevens, but to examine the situation of Eliza Hadwin with my own eyes, and, if possible, to extricate my father from his unfortunate situation. My father's state had given me the deepest concern. I figured to myself his condition, besotted by brutal appetites, reduced to beggary, shut up in a noisome prison, and condemned to that society which must foster all his depraved propensities. I revolved various schemes for his relief. A few hundreds would take him from prison, but how should he be afterwards disposed of? How should he be cured of his indolent habits? How should he be screened from the contagion of vicious society? By what means, consistently with my own wants and the claims of others, should I secure to him an acceptable subsistence? Exhortation and example were vain. Nothing but restraint would keep him at a distance from the haunts of brawling and debauchery. The want of money would be no obstacle to prodigality and waste. Credit would be resorted to as long as it would answer his demand. When that failed, he would once more be thrown into a prison, the same means to extricate him would have to be repeated, and money be thus put into the pockets of the most worthless of mankind, the agents of drunkenness and blasphemy, without any permanent advantage to my father, the principal object of my charity. Though unable to fix on any plausible mode of proceeding, I determined, at least, to discover his present condition. Perhaps something might suggest itself upon the spot suited to my purpose. Without delay, I proceeded to the village of Newtown, and, alighting at the door of the prison, inquired for my father. "Sawney Mervyn you want, I suppose," said the keeper. "Poor fellow! He came into limbo in a crazy condition, and has been a burden on my hands ever since. After lingering along for some time, he was at last kind enough to give us the slip. It is just a week since he drank his last pint, and died." I was greatly shocked at this intelligence. It was some time before my reason came to my aid, and showed me that this was an event, on the whole, and on a disinterested and dispassionate view, not unfortunate. The keeper knew not my relation to the deceased, and readily recounted the behaviour of the prisoner and the circumstances of his last hours. I shall not repeat the narrative. It is useless to keep alive the sad remembrance. He was now beyond the reach of my charity or pity, and, since reflection could answer no beneficial end to him, it was my duty to divert my thoughts into different channels, and live henceforth for my own happiness and that of those who were within the sphere of my influence. I was now alone in the world, so far as the total want of kindred creates solitude. Not one of my blood, nor even of my name, was to be found in this quarter of the world. Of my mother's kindred I knew nothing. So far as friendship or service might be claimed from them, to me they had no existence. I was destitute of all those benefits which flow from kindred in relation to protection, advice, or property. My inheritance was nothing. Not a single relic or trinket in my possession constituted a memorial of my family. The scenes of my childish and juvenile days were dreary and desolate. The fields which I was wont to traverse, the room in which I was born, retained no traces of the past. They were the property and residence of strangers, who knew nothing of the former tenants, and who, as I was now told, had hastened to new model and transform everything within and without the habitation. These images filled me with melancholy, which, however, disappeared in proportion as I approached the abode of my beloved girl. Absence had endeared the image of my Bess (I loved to call her so) to my soul. I could not think of her without a melting softness at my heart, and tears in which pain and pleasure were unaccountably mingled. As I approached Curling's house, I strained my sight in hopes of distinguishing her form through the evening dusk. I had told her of my purpose by letter. She expected my approach at this hour, and was stationed, with a heart throbbing with impatience, at the roadside, near the gate. As soon as I alighted, she rushed into my arms. I found my sweet friend less blithesome and contented than I wished. Her situation, in spite of the parental and sisterly regards which she received from the Curlings, was mournful and dreary to her imagination. Rural business was irksome and insufficient to fill up her time. Her life was tiresome and uniform and heavy. I ventured to blame her discontent, and pointed out the advantages of her situation. "Whence," said I, "can these dissatisfactions and repinings arise?" "I cannot tell," said she. "I don't know how it is with me. I am always sorrowful and thoughtful. Perhaps I think too much of my poor father and of Susan, and yet that can't be it neither, for I think of them but seldom, not half as much as I ought, perhaps. I think of nobody almost but you. Instead of minding my business, or chatting and laughing with Peggy Curling, I love to get by myself, to read over and over your letters, or to think how you were employed just then, and how happy I should be if I were in Fanny Maurice's place. But it is all over now. This visit rewards me for everything. I wonder how I could ever be sullen or mopeful. I will behave better, indeed I will, and be always, as now, a most happy girl." The greater part of 3 days was spent in the society of my friend, in listening to her relation of all that had happened during my absence, and in communicating, in my turn, every incident which had befallen myself. After this, I once more returned to the city. End of chapter 43. 44 of Arthur Mervyn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Arthur Mervyn by Charles Brockden Brown, Chapter 44. I now set about carrying my plan of life into effect. I began with ardent zeal and unwearied diligence the career of medical study. I bespoke the counsels and instructions of my friend, attended him on his professional visits, and acted, in all practicable cases, as his substitute. I found this application of time more pleasurable than I had imagined. My mind gladly expanded itself, as it were, for the reception of new ideas. My curiosity grew more eager in proportion as it was supplied with food, and every day added strength to the assurance that I was no insignificant and worthless being, that I was destined to be something in this scene of existence, and might some time lay claim to the gratitude and homage of my fellow men. I was far from being, however, monopolized by these pursuits. I was formed on purpose for the gratification of social intercourse. To love and to be loved, to exchange hearts and mingle sentiments with all the virtuous and amiable whom my good fortune had placed within the circuit of my knowledge, I always esteemed my highest enjoyment and my chief duty. Carlton and his sister, Mrs. Wentworth, and Achsa Fielding, were my most valuable associates beyond my own family. With all these my correspondence was frequent and unreserved, but chiefly with the latter. This lady had dignity and independence, a generous and enlightened spirit beyond what her education had taught me to expect. She was circumspect and cautious in her deportment, and was not prompt to make advances or accept them. She withheld her esteem and confidence until she had full proof of their being deserved. I am not sure that her treatment of me was fully conformable to her rules. My manners, indeed, as she once told me, she had never met with in another. Ordinary rules were so totally overlooked in my behaviour that it seemed impossible for any one who knew me to adhere to them. No option was left but to admit my claims to friendship and confidence instantly, or to reject them altogether. I was not conscious of this singularity. The internal and undiscovered character of another weighed nothing with me in the question whether they should be treated with frankness or reserve. I felt no scruple on any occasion to disclose every feeling and every event. Any one who could listen found me willing to talk. Every talker found me willing to listen. Every one had my sympathy and kindness without claiming it, but I claimed the kindness and sympathy of every one. Achsa Fielding's countenance bespoke, I thought, a mind worthy to be known and to be loved. The first moment I engaged her attention, I told her so. I related the little story of my family, spread out before her all my reasonings and determinations, my notions of right and wrong, my fears and wishes. All this was done with sincerity and fervour, with gestures, actions, and looks, in which I felt as if my whole soul was visible. Her superior age, sedateness, and prudence gave my deportment a filial freedom and affection, and I was fond of calling her mamma. I particularly dwelt upon the history of my dear country girl, painted her form and countenance, recounted our dialogues, and related all my schemes for making her wise, and good, and happy. On these occasions my friend would listen to me with the mutest attention. I showed her the letters I received, and offered her for her perusal those which I wrote in answer, before they were sealed and sent. On these occasions she would look by turns on my face and away from me. A varying hue would play upon her cheek, and her eyes were fuller than was common of meaning. "Such and such," I once said, "are my notions. Now, what do you think?" "Think!" emphatically, and turning somewhat aside, she answered, "that you are the most strange of human creatures." "But tell me," I resumed, following and searching her averted eyes, "am I right? Would you do thus? Can you help me to improve my girl? I wish you knew the bewitching little creature. How would that heart overflow with affection and with gratitude towards you? She should be your daughter. No, you are too nearly of an age for that. A sister, her elder sister, you should be. That, when there is no other relation, includes them all. Fond sisters you would be, and I the fond brother of you both." My eyes glistened as I spoke. In truth, I am in that respect a mere woman. My friend was more powerfully moved. After a momentary struggle, she burst into tears. "Good heaven!" said I, "what ails you? Are you not well?" Her looks betrayed an unaccountable confusion, from which she quickly recovered. "It was folly to be thus affected. Something ailed me, I believe, but it is past. But come, you want some lines of finishing the description of the boa in La Cepide." "True, and I have 20 minutes to spare. Poor Franks is very ill indeed, but he cannot be seen till 9. We'll read till then." Thus, on the wings of pleasure and improvement, passed my time, not without some hues occasionally of a darker tint. My heart was now and then detected in sighing. This occurred when my thoughts glanced at the poor Eliza, and measured, as it were, the interval between us. "We are too far apart," thought I. The best solace on these occasions was the company of Mrs. Fielding, her music, her discourse, or some book which she set me to rehearsing to her. One evening, when preparing to pay her a visit, I received the following letter from my Bess. To A. Mervyn, Curling's, May 6th, 1794. Where does this letter you promised me stay all this while? Indeed, Arthur, you torment me more than I deserve, and more than I could ever find it in my heart to do to you. You treat me cruelly. I must say so, though I offend you. I must write, though you do not deserve that I should, and though I fear I am in a humour not very fit for writing. I had better go to my chamber and weep. Weep at your unkindness, I was going to say, but perhaps it is only forgetfulness. And yet what can be more unkind than forgetfulness? I am sure I have never forgotten you. Sleep itself, which wraps all other images in forgetfulness, only brings you nearer, and makes me see you more distinctly. But where can this letter stay? Oh, that— Hush, foolish girl! If a word of that kind escape thy lips, Arthur will be angry with thee, and then indeed thou mightest weep in earnest. Then thou wouldst have some cause for thy tears. More than once already has he almost broken thy heart with his reproaches. Sore and weak as it is now, any new reproaches would assuredly break it quite. I will be content. I will be as good a housewife and dairywoman, stir about as briskly and sing as merrily as Peggy Curling. Why not? I am as young, as innocent, and enjoy as good health. Alas, she has reason to be merry. She has father, mother, brothers, but I have none. And he that was all these, and more than all these to me, has forgotten me. But perhaps it is some accident that hinders. Perhaps Oliver left the market earlier than he used to do, or you mistook the house, or perhaps some poor creature was sick, was taken suddenly ill, and you were busy in chafing his clay-cold limbs. It fell to you to wipe the clammy drops from his brow. Such things often happen, don't they, Arthur, to people of your trade, and some such thing has happened now, and that was the reason you did not write. And if so, shall I repine at your silence? Oh, no! At such a time the poor Bess might easily be, and ought to be, forgotten. She would not deserve your love if she could repine at a silence brought about this way. And oh, may it be so! May there be nothing worse than this! If the sick man— See, Arthur, how my hand trembles. Can you read this scrawl? What is always bad, my fears make worse than ever. I must not think that. And yet, if it be so, if my friend himself be sick, what will become of me? Of me that ought to cherish you and comfort you, that ought to be your nurse. Endure you for your sickness when she cannot remove it. Oh, that— I will speak out. Oh, that this strange scruple had never possessed you! Why should I not be with you? Who can love you and serve you as well as I? In sickness and health I will console and assist you. Why will you deprive yourself of such a comforter and such an aid as I would be to you? Dear Arthur, think better of it. Let me leave this dreary spot, where, indeed, as long as I am thus alone, I can enjoy no comfort. Let me come to you. I will put up with anything for the sake of seeing you, though it be but once a day. Any garret or cellar in the dirtiest lane or darkest alley will be good enough for me. I will think it a palace, so that I can but see you now and then. Do not refuse, do not argue with me, so fond you always are of arguing. My heart is set upon your compliance. And yet, dearly as I prize your company, I would not ask it if I thought there was anything improper. You say there is, and you talk about it in a way that I do not understand. For my sake, you tell me you refuse, but let me entreat you to comply for my sake. Your pen cannot teach me like your tongue. You write me long letters, and tell me a great deal in them, but my soul droops when I call to mind your voice and your looks, and think how long a time must pass before I see you and hear you again. I have no spirit to think upon the words and paper before me. My eye and thought wander far away. I bethink me how many questions I might ask you, how many doubts you might clear up if you were but within hearing, if you were but close to me, but I cannot ask them here. I am too poor a creature at the pen, and somehow or another it always happens, I can only write about myself or about you. By the time I have said all this, I have tired my fingers, and when I set about telling you how this poem and that story have affected me, I am at a loss for words. I am bewildered and bemazed, as it were. It is not so when we talk to one another. With your arm about me and your sweet face close to mine, I can prattle forever. Then my heart overflows at my lips. After hours thus spent, it seems as if there were 1,000 things still to be said. Then I can tell you what the book has told me. I can repeat scores of verses by heart, though I heard them only once read, but it is because you have read them to me. Then there is nobody here to answer my questions. They never look into books. They hate books. They think it a waste of time to read. Even Peggy, who you say has a naturally strong mind, wonders what I can find to amuse myself in a book. In her playful mood she is always teasing me to lay it aside. I do not mind her, for I like to read, but if I did not like it before, I could not help doing so ever since you told me that nobody could gain your love who was not fond of books. And yet, though I like it on that account more than I did, I don't read somehow so earnestly and understand so well as I used to, when my mind was all at ease, always frolicsome, and ever upon tiptoe, as I may say. How strangely, have you not observed it, I am altered of late. I, that was ever light of heart, the very soul of gaiety, brimful of glee, am now demure as our old Tabby, and not half as wise. Tabby had wit enough to keep her paws out of the coals, whereas poor I have—but no matter what. It will never come to pass, I see that. So many reasons for everything. Such looking forward. Arthur, are not men sometimes too wise to be happy? I am now so grave. Not one smile can Peggy sometimes get from me, though she tries for it the whole day. But I know how it comes. Strange indeed if losing father and sister, and thrown upon the wide world, penniless and friendless too, now that you forget me, I should continue to smile. No, I shall never smile again. At least while I stay here, I never shall, I believe. If a certain somebody suffer me to live with him, near him, I mean, perhaps the sight of him as he enters the door, perhaps the sound of his voice asking, "Where is my Bess?" might produce a smile. Such a one as the very thought produces now, yet not, I hope, so transient and so quickly followed by a tear. Women are born, they say, to trouble, and tears are given them for their relief. 'Tis all very true. Let it be as I wish, will you? If Oliver bring not back good tidings, if he bring not a letter from thee, or thy letter still refuses my request, I don't know what may happen. Consent if you love your poor girl. E. H. End of chapter 44.